So I joined the university a couple of years ago, and I have the distinction in being from the pharma industry, and I spent the majority of my career there, spanning back to the 1990s. So just to give you some context about what I'm going to talk about today is commercial research, predominantly in the pharma setting, also with medical devices. I started off working for these very big companies at the top here, Pfizer, IQVIA, Roche, and I went to slightly smaller pharma, kind of 10 to 20,000 people. And then at the end of my career, I was working for tiny companies where we were usually either like single digit number of employees, 20 different people, maybe if we were lucky, to run startups in the pharma industry. So that's a little bit about me. I worked in clinical trial operations, initially monitoring clinical trials, going out to investigator trial sites and looking at the data, then managing the clinical trials, moving then into actually designing them, and then probably the least interesting bit, the budget management and the funding. But without that, of course, the trials don't happen. Then I took a bit of a career direction change because I didn't want to be getting on a plane and flying all over Europe and the rest of the world all the time. So I went into quality assurance. So I was auditing clinical trials, looking at quality management systems and quality assurance strategy. And with these small companies, which are very virtual, where we've only got 10 people, we outsource everything. So we could have 10, 20 different vendors that each take care of a particular aspect of the study. So I'd be responsible for making sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and in conjunction with the regulations. So that's a little bit about me. Now, I'm going to try and do a Menti. I have a very patchy experience with Mentis, but we'll give it a go. And if not, we can just do a show of hands. So I'm going to just ask you, start my Menti. Have you ever worked for a pharma or biotech or other commercial research organisation? And that would include a holiday job, an internship, you know, or a full-time role, and any kind of interaction. Wow, okay. Oh, okay, got some. "14 responses, 17. We've got a couple of people here, I think, it's fair to say. Does anyone want to make an admission of who they work for, when they work for them? Or stay under the radar, that's fair enough. Okay, so it's just useful for me to understand, so predominantly we've got an audience here who haven't worked with commercial pharma before. And seeing as that works so well, I'm going to do another one as well. Let's try, go to the next slide. Go on. Next slide. Okay, oops, too far. This one here, I just thought would be interesting because we've got quite a diverse audience in the room. Where's my mouse gone? Here it is. What do you think makes research reproducible? One or two items. Just, it's always interesting to see what people think. Quite a lot about code, quite a lot about transparency, making code, possibly data as well open, robust data sets, common methods, readability. So I think we're all pretty much on the same page, aren't we? If you asked a different audience, like people who are perhaps not so much on the data end of research, you'd probably get slightly different answers. I work a lot with the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol. They've had a very sort of discipline-specific issue of reproducibility over the years, so they have slightly different views about this around bias and data collection. I think we're all kind of very much on the same page. We're interested in transparency, we're interested in robust code and robust methods. So when we come to commercial research, if you were saying to someone in commercial research, how do you make your research reproducible? They probably wouldn't understand what you're actually asking them, because we don't really use that term reproducibility in commercial research. It's kind of expected that any research that you do is reproducible. And if you think about, why is this? I'm not going to. So why is this? Why do we have to have quality in commercial research? And if you think about all the things that have happened over the years, I think about thalidomide, other disasters, the Tijanero phase 1 disaster that happened in 2005. Well, anything that comes out of a pharma pipeline, first of all, it needs to be safe. Okay, now safety is a relative term, as we all know, but by and large, the benefits of the product have to outweigh the risks. It needs to be effective. It needs to do what the medicine is licensed to do. And also, it needs to be approved. The data needs to be presented to the regulatory authorities in a format that they can look at, they can scrutinise it, they can reconstruct it, and they can go, yes, on balance, we agree that your product is safe and effective, and you've shown us the evidence that that's the case. So how do we get to that state in commercial research? So we've kind of synonymised a quality system for pharma research that does all of this with reproducibility in an academic setting. How do we get there? Well, we have a quality system, and what we've evolved over what's probably around 70 years now of regulation in the pharmaceutical industry are risk-based quality systems. So we identify the aspects of the research that are important to quality. We look at what the risks are to quality, and they could be numerous. It could be safety risks, it could be data integrity risks. We develop risk reduction strategies. We monitor and we mitigate the risks, and then we assess them and we approve. Over time, these have developed to the point where it's ingrained and it's embedded. It hasn't always been that way. In 2005, the Tijanero study, we didn't have these risk-based quality systems, which is why that disaster happened. The fact that we injected 6 men with the same product at exactly the same time, and they all got suddenly very unwell, with hindsight, was quite a silly thing to do. If we'd actually just injected 1 person, first of all, we would have had 1 very ill person, not 6. So they've stood the test of time. And I think one example that I was thinking about earlier on, during COVID, all these clinical trial monitors that would go out and they would look at the data, the health records at clinical trial sites. All that stopped during COVID, which was a disaster for clinical research. It was dangerous for patients because they weren't having their research data monitored, and it was slowing down clinical trial development. So what the MHRA did is they got together with the NHS and said, okay, we've got a risk-based approach here, we can embrace this. Companies, if you can demonstrate to us that you've got secure systems, you've got cyber essentials, and you've got other mechanisms in place to protect patient confidentiality, we'll allow your staff to actually access patient records remotely from their own homes. And so after about 6 months, clinical trial monitoring got back up and running. So that's a good example of where risk-based approaches keep research moving, they keep patients safe, and they keep data safe. Now, we have to prove the provenance of our data in commercial research, and we also have to prove the provenance of our data in academic research. This ALCO acronym has been around since the 1990s, but it's really kind of gathered traction in the last 10 years. So this is a data provenance test. So any data that comes out of a clinical trial you should be able to attribute it, it should be legible, and it should remain legible over time. It should be contemporaneous, it should be original, or you should know the origin, and it should be accurate, or you should know the bounds of the accuracy. So that's a really important concept alongside the risk-based design. So this is all very well in a traditional clinical trial setting. We can cope with all of this. We can use risk-based methods, and we can do a little data integrity risk assessment. What about, though, when we start getting into the realms of real-world data? This is where this all becomes a little bit more abstract, certainly thinking about data provenance. And for the last few years, there's really been a bit of a hiatus and a bit of an uncertainty, but we are now getting to the point now where we've got some regulation and some guidance coming out about how we can use things like real-world data sets, AI and machine learning tools in a clinical trial setting in a way that our regulators will accept and they will approve. So we've got this draft guidance from the FDA. I've taken this one because it's the most succinct. So if you want to use machine learning AI tools in the development of a medicinal product in the US, you go through this 7-step process. So making sure that you understand the context of use, you're assessing your AI model, you're developing a plan to make sure your model is credible, you execute the plan, you document the results of your credibility assessment. That doesn't always happen, we know. And then you can determine the adequacy of that model. And then you will go back again and you will refine it. So this is a draft guideline. It only came out in January. It will probably be draft for a number of years if we know the FDA. But that's useful. That's giving us some context to work within. And importantly, it complements our risk-based approach. The EMA one is actually very similar. That is formalised in a reflection paper. Reflection papers are odd with the EMA. They're not legally binding, but they kind of are viewed as they are. So, you still have to follow it because they'll pull you up on it if you don't. So we've got our risk-based quality system that's been around largely since around 2005. And we're now looking at how we can integrate machine learning and AI tools into our clinical trial development. So how do these map? Well, we've got step 3, assess the AI model risk, conduct your risk assessment. That kind of maps, that's good. Step 4, develop your plan to establish credibility. You develop your risk reduction strategy. Execute the plan, monitor and mitigate risk, and determine the adequacy of the tool, assess and improve. So whilst what we're seeing is we're seeing regulation, layers of regulation being built on top of each other. Actually, I think with reproducibility, the way that it translates from commercial research into academic research, it's all about the risk-based approach. So in terms of the AI Act coming out of the EMA, it's the risk-based approach. So that's where I think channel your reproducibility efforts in terms of using risk assessments and documenting the results of your risk assessments so that you can explain them to other people. So the other thing that's interesting as well in terms of transparency, that was mentioned on our little slide. The transparency rule, the European Medicines Agency is really pushing transparency in commercial clinical research. Now they're pushing against a door that was been very firmly closed and bolted for many years by the pharma industry. But now there is a requirement that certain aspects of trials will be publicly reported. If you have any significant issues in your trial and if you breach the regulations, those are publicly visible. If you have to halt your trial for safety reasons or for some unexpected reason, that is now visible. And if your clinical study report, whilst it's redacted to protect IP and patient confidentiality, these incredibly detailed reports are now going to be publicly available. And this is quite exciting. And I keep logging onto the clinical trial information system, which is this web portal, going, well, what can I see? We know which companies have had stuffed up and had a serious breach. And I keep looking and I can't find anything, because what's happening is that there was originally a 7-year rule where companies could kick the can down the road for 7 years to protect their IP. That was removed last year, and we're down to the last few weeks of companies being able to stall on this. So I'm going to be checking back on this soon. But transparency is good. Transparency, as we know, drives up standards. And companies are already doing a good job on how reproducible and how good quality their research is. Now they need to work on their transparency. So that I think is interesting. So now looking at some sort of data science use cases as well. So which companies are actually using these risk-based approaches, and where can we look for examples of people who are actually pushing the boundaries a bit? So I picked out 3 different examples here. There's a group called Impala. This is a cross-industry consortium. Some very big companies like Roche and Biogen, some smaller ones as well. And they've got a group of data scientists and regulatory experts who've developed this tool for monitoring real-time clinical trial data. So it's called the Clinical Trial Anomaly Spotter. And one of their use cases is oncology clinical trials. Historically, adverse events are often underreported in oncology trials for a number of reasons, partly because the number of adverse events can be overwhelming for sites to collect. Patients can have been through multiple trials previously and they just expect to get side effects, so they don't report them. But it becomes a big issue when you're trying to monitor those products and see if they're safe for registration, if you're under-reporting safety. So they've got a tool now which actually looks at real-time clinical trial data as it's reported And they highlight areas and centres and patient groups perhaps where there might be underreporting, so that then companies can go in and investigate. Another example here, a small company called Lindus Health, they market themselves as a disruptor. They have actually been using machine learning on the other end of the trial spectrum. So while they're actually designing the trial, so they've been accessing freely available databases, leveraged off clinicaltrials.gov, and they're using LLMs to design optimal clinical trial protocols. So it can take up to 6 months to write a clinical trial protocol, get it reviewed to the point where it's ready to submit to a regulatory authority. They're cutting that down to a couple of weeks in some cases, because they're actually scraping all this data and building things which they think are the best possible protocols for a particular therapeutic area. And then lastly, you probably all know about this, DeepMind. You've got the AlphaFold 3, which is now freely available. So there are lots of different use cases where people are using AI, LLMs, and people are using the risk-based approach. But importantly, I think what they're doing is that all of these tools are open source. So I think there's an acceptance that if you're going to use this, the best way that you can get trust is to be transparent about it. So no one likes a bonnet that's nailed shut and we can't see what's underneath it. So I think one of the key things that farmers now are having to adopt is the levels of transparency that we've historically only ever seen in academic research. So transparency is going to be a big element moving forward. How much have I got left, pal? Perfect. So that brings me to my summary slide. So does reproducibility equal transparency? Well, I think what we're seeing is that in the modern age, you're going to have transparency because people won't trust what you do, especially when it comes to AI and machine learning. And in commercial research, historically, we've got our risk-based approaches to quality, which seem to be standing the test of time. They weren't enough in their own right, the clinical trial regulations, to account for what was needed for AI, but by bolting on top some specific guidance like the FDA and the EMA are doing, those are actually seem to be fairly robust. Risk-based approaches are here to stay. And demonstrable quality. We need to keep providing that demonstrable level of quality to all of our stakeholders, not least to all the patients who are involved in these trials. And we seem to be able to do that. We've found ways with more modern systems about how we can keep producing that data to show that what we're doing is safe, effective, and reproducible and replicable. On the academic side, so we've always had this sort of transparency-driven approach to quality, or at least I'd say in the last 15 to 20 years. We do have some discipline-specific approaches as well. So if you look at what they do in psychological science, it's quite different to what you guys I think are doing. But they have particular focuses within disciplines about the reproducibility challenges that they've encountered in the past, like cancer biology is another example that have had specific reproducibility challenges, and their reproducibility drives are really focused on fixing those problems. And then I think also we need to address things like the research culture issues around reproducibility. We know the significant amount of time it takes for people to prepare their data and their code for sharing, the burden that it places on the researcher, and how perhaps it's a little bit unfair that you can still get published even in journals that state that you have to make your data and code available, even when you demonstrably don't. So there are research culture issues which are ongoing, but I think, so my area of overlap, I think where academia and commercial research are on the same page is that agreeing that transparency is a good thing and transparency needs to be embedded and we need to move forward with that. Data sharing is in its infancy in commercial research, but I think we're going to probably get to a point in the next few years where perhaps at least clinical trial data sets can maybe shared through some mechanism, maybe through synthetic data. And ultimately what we need to do both on the commercial side and the academic side is to continue to build trust in AI so that we can actually capitalise on the potential of the tool. So that's the main part of my talk. I just wanted to here to have a couple of shameless plugs. We are forming a meta-research group at the University of Bristol. Meta-research, anyone who's interested on research. We've got a launch meeting on the 6th of May. Drop me an email if you want to. There's an email there. We'd love to have some representatives from your communities to come along. either to present or just to listen. And then this week, my team's launching a SharePoint site, which is currently just going to be available on the University of Bristol SharePoint, but we will do, as the next step, make it publicly available on a public-facing website where we've got lots of tools and resources on reproducibility. Thank you.